Good morning, everybody. I'm Anushka Makbul, the Programs Coordinator at Urban Green Council. Urban Green's values are excellence, inclusion, collaboration, and engagement. And we invite you to be mindful of these during the program, both when you're listening in and when you're asking questions. Welcome to today's Urban Green Live Office to Residential Conversions, the Carbon Story. I'd now like to turn it over to our CEO, John Mandyck.
Anushka, thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. Welcome to Urban Green Live. I'm your host, John Mandyck, the CEO of Urban Green. This is a program series where I'll be interviewing global experts to better understand how we get to a net zero carbon future. And you get to participate too, because we'll have live Q&A in just a bit. Before I get started, I want to thank the U.S. Green Building Council for helping to sponsor today's program. We're very grateful for our partnership with USGBC and their support, their longstanding support for the work of Urban Green. So thank you to our friends at USGBC. Today, we're joining Arup for the release of their new study that quantifies the carbon savings for converting office buildings to residential spaces. This is a question I've been wondering about for a long time, and I'm sure some of you have too. So I'm really excited that we have brand new research to help answer that question. So I want to bring our guests on screen. Welcome, David. Welcome, Tess. Our guests today from Arup are David Farnsworth. He's the principal at the company, and Tess McNamara, who's a senior consultant for climate and sustainability at Arup. So David and Tess, welcome to the program. Arup, is a global collective of more than 17,000 designers, engineers, and sustainability consultants tackling some of the biggest sustainability issues for buildings on our planet. And we're grateful that they've been a longtime member and supporter of Urban Green, and I'm really excited to see the research today. So David is going to share why Arup commissioned this study and this research. Then he's going to turn it over to Tess, who's going to run through some of the main findings, and then I'll be back to do the Q&A after that. So David, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, John. Thanks all for having us today. We're really excited to be here. I'm sure, like many of you, we've been quite keenly interested in the potential for adaptive reuse of our currently underutilized office assets. New York City, like many of our great cities around the nation and around the world, are grappling with the changes resulting from the pandemic. We're seeing office vacancies rise and occupancies drop as people figure out how they like to work, and the return to work is slower as people continue to work from home. Meanwhile, our cities are also seeing a supply constraint for housing, which is resulting in lots of social inequities and difficulties for how to maintain urban lifestyles here in these great cities. And we were quite excited at the prospect of perhaps we could solve both the office vacancy issues and the and the housing crisis in one go by reapportioning the use of these underutilized office assets to residential, all in the backdrop of a global climate crisis, with an understanding that we are seeing increasingly extreme weather events reminding us of the future to come. And so I was quite excited in January of this year to see the Mayor's Task Force come out with very clear recommendations on suggestions for regulations that could be modified that would enable a more easy adaptation of a wider stock of office buildings to residential. And then I was quickly frustrated and disillusioned when the recommendations, kind of went up in flames along with the governor's housing policy due to kind of gridlock at the state assembly level in spring of this year. And digging through the task force recommendations, while they're very good suggestions for regulation changes, I noticed a lack of there wasn't any mention of the environmental benefits and the embodied carbon benefits. And we've always, our approach to low carbon, sustainable development is always to first look at, what are the assets that we have, and the lowest carbon structure you can build is the one you already have. And we thought that this is a, perfect case, for we've got all of these existing underutilized office assets, there's surely an enormous carbon benefit to, repurposing them rather than, leaving them underutilized and building new residential stock in order to solve the housing crisis. So we thought that, perhaps we could add some value to the political discourse on, on getting some of these regulations passed that will enable further, conversions to occur, and wanted to investigate what is the potential carbon impact of office to resi conversions. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tess.
Great. Thanks, David. I think we're gonna bring up the screen. Perfect. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Tess McNamara with Arup, and I'm excited to share some research with you today titled Office to Residential Conversions, the Carbon Story. Go to the next slide. So this research aimed to answer a specific question: how much carbon could be saved by 2050 if New York City expanded the range of buildings eligible for office to residential conversions to all buildings constructed before 1990. Next slide. So our research was framed using the results of the Office Adaptive Reuse study that David just mentioned, that was put out by City Planning earlier this year. And DCP's study proposes changing zoning regulations to allow for more conversions. Currently, only a limited set of office buildings in the city can actually be converted to residential based on existing zoning restrictions. Their study found that the proposed zoning changes could create 20,000 additional homes through conversion, which is just a chunk of the 500,000 homes that Mayor Adams says need to be built in the next decade to alleviate the housing crisis in New York. Next slide. So to delve just a bit more into the zoning context, so current zoning regulations, which are shown in the top chart, this is from that task force study, only allow conversion of office buildings built before 1960. There are some exceptions in the financial district for 60s and 70s buildings. But the proposed zoning would expand conversion flexibility to all buildings, all office buildings built before December of 1990. So that's that blue bar. So our study was looking specifically at this group of office buildings that are up for rezoning. So those constructed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Next slide. And so this is what that looks like. So this map is showing the office buildings that are over 10,000 square feet, built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that are currently not eligible or have limited eligibility for conversion. So this comes to 222 total buildings that we used in our analysis. So we analyzed the operational and embodied carbon savings from converting these office buildings to understand the scale of savings that could result from the change in zoning. It's important to note that we're showing carbon saving values for the window of opportunity that this zoning could create based on the total square footage of the building set in question. So we're looking at both embodied and operational carbon savings, and that means we're taking a whole life carbon perspective. So I'll go into some of these definitions. By embodied carbon, I mean the emissions associated with the materials and construction processes throughout the whole life cycle of a building. That's the definition. So that includes material extraction, transportation, construction, the use of the materials, and then eventually demolition and disposal of the materials. Operational carbon is more straightforward. So that's just the emissions associated with the energy used to operate the building. So essentially the carbon impact of your monthly energy bill. To get a whole life carbon approach, we looked at the embodied and operational emissions together out to 2050 to understand the entire footprint of the built asset. Go to the next slide. So this research calculated the whole life carbon savings that could result from converting our 222 office buildings into residential and retrofitting them in the process. To make this calculation a little bit easier, we broke down the set of buildings into typologies, which are pictured here. So the first division was by decade, then we looked at width or depth of the lot, and then we looked at the type of windows in the building, so a curtain wall or a punch window and a solid wall. And these distinctions have implications for how much embodied or operational carbon could be saved through the conversion, which I'll talk through. Next slide. So with our group of 12 buildings, we picked the most average building in each group to end up with 12 typologies. These are our 4 from the 60s. So to discuss that first typology breakdown, the buildings that are very wide, so these 2 on the left in this case, they have a lot width or depth over 100 feet, require additional structural carving of the floor plates to make them usable as residential buildings. So to get the appropriate light and air into the floor plate to make them reasonable dwelling units. And so that demolition and then replacement of that area on top of the building will have an embodied carbon implication because it's including material we're disposing of and then new material being brought in as new construction on top. Next slide. So here are our 4 from the 70s. And so whether the facade has a curtain wall or punch windows also has implications for embodied carbon, but also operational carbon. So this is the second important distinction. We made the conservative assumption in the study that all windows would have to be replaced, given the operable window requirement for residential units and the assumed state of the 50-year-old facades in many of these buildings. So replacing a full curtain wall, the full facade of the building, like reskinning it, will improve your energy performance. You're making it a tighter envelope, which we'll talk about, but it also requires more upfront embodied carbon because of the amount of new material going into the project. Next slide. And these are our 4 typologies from the 80s. I also want to point out some of the vacancy rates here, which were listed on the slide. So many are over 60% vacant, and we weren't picking examples for vacancy in this case. We were looking at energy and floor plate size. And it was also really interesting as an architect and native New Yorker to see how the character of these buildings changed between the decades. So these are definitely very 80s buildings. Next slide. So now we'll get into a bit more detail about the actual carbon calculations just quickly. So for the wide typologies, which require that structural carving that I mentioned, we calculated the embodied carbon from the demolition and disposal of the structure being removed, and then the upfront embodied carbon from the production and construction of the additional FAR built on top. So that's sort of diagrammed here. Next slide. And then all buildings are either punch windows or curtain wall windows. So we calculated the embodied carbon from the demolition and disposal of windows or the entire curtain wall in both cases, because we're replacing out the windows. And then the upfront emissions from production and construction of the new windows or the new curtain wall. Next slide. For the operational carbon piece, so the first step was that the energy use of the existing office buildings, which we had all of that data from the city for all 222, was first scaled to residential use. And then we accounted for a series of energy conservation measures that would result from the retrofit, so things you would do during the conversion. And again, the distinction of window type was the most important here. So for all buildings, we applied a lighting reduction, HVAC and domestic hot water electrification. So we assumed that we were electrifying all of the buildings, and then you get a energy savings from the window replacement. But for curtain wall buildings, we were also able to account for increased wall insulation and reduced air infiltration because we're putting in a brand new facade. So curtain wall buildings are able to claim higher energy reductions in our study because we're saying the full facade will be replaced. Next slide. So the baseline case we used to evaluate these savings is a business as usual condition. And this graph on the right is showing cumulative whole life carbon emissions for this baseline condition each year out to 2050. So I'll explain that a little bit. For embodied carbon, the baseline condition is if the footprint of the additional homes were created from ground up new residential construction. So if we weren't going to reuse the office buildings. So this is shown in red. The emissions happen when the homes are built, 2023 in theory in this study, and then they're fixed into the future because you're not building new buildings out in the next 25 years. For operational carbon, the baseline condition is if the 222 office buildings are just left to operate as they do today. So this is in purple. And the cumulative emissions grow each year because your building is constantly using energy and therefore emitting carbon. So it adds up over time. Next slide. So that was the baseline condition. And here are the savings that could result from the conversions. So this dashed line at the top is that cumulative baseline case we just saw, the sort of top line of that previous graph, where the office buildings stay as is, and the new homes are built from ground up with new construction. And then the red and purple lines here are the emissions that would result from the converted scenario. So in red are the embodied emissions that occur from the conversion, which comes from that structural carving of some of the buildings and the window and the curtain wall replacement that we discussed. So this is 61% lower than a ground up scenario. And then in purple are the operational emissions from the new converted residential buildings, which are much lower than the existing office buildings because of those efficiency retrofits we did in the conversion. And these lines flatten out over time because of electrification and grid decarbonization. It's important to note that this model is as if we, flipped a switch and all of the conversions happened in 2023 for all of the buildings in the data set. So we looked at, the most expansive version of the conversion scenario to show potential savings if this window of opportunity were fully seized. So the potential savings come to a 49% reduction in 2030 and then a 54% reduction below the base case in 2050. Next slide. So I'm just going to go through a few interesting corollaries that came out of this research, the first of which is the impact on Local Law 97 compliance. So the graph on the left is business as usual office building emissions relative to Local Law 97 thresholds. And the graph on the right represents the converted residential building emissions. So starting on the left, the blue dashed line at the top is the 2024 emissions limit for office buildings under the law. And the green is that reduced limit in 2030 as the law gets more stringent. So you'll notice that by 2030, 10 out of our 12 existing office typologies have emissions over the limit in green. So this just underscores the buildings in our data set are poor performers. They're exactly the type of outdated buildings that the law is trying to target, and they're mostly going to face fines in 2030. In our converted graph on the right, though, you'll see that all of the buildings comply with the 2030 residential limits because of that electrification and the retrofits that we accounted for during the conversion. So this was just an interesting note, sort of further proves that expanding flexibility and support for the conversions could facilitate compliance with Local Law 97 because developers would have additional financial impetus to actually take on the retrofits and recoup some of the costs. Next slide. So the second interesting corollary is the carbon payback from replacing a full curtain wall. So critics of Local Law 97 have pointed out that it doesn't consider the embodied carbon cost of things like a full facade replacement that the law is trying to incentivize, looking just at operational carbon savings. And we realized that we have the data to answer whether this facade replacement actually makes sense from a whole life carbon perspective. So this graph is looking at the scenario in which a full curtain wall is replaced in 2023. So that's that jump in red embodied carbon. So there is a significant embodied carbon spend, you could say, from a full curtain wall replacement. All the new steel, the glass, the material going in. The black dash line is the baseline scenario. So that's just saying the operational emissions if the building continues to operate today with no changes, no retrofits. And so what we see from the whole life carbon perspective is that the upfront embodied carbon cost of the full facade replacement pays back in 10 years. So starting in 2033, we actually see savings below the baseline case because with the full facade replacement, we've made our building more efficient and it's paid back that upfront spend. And the end result is that by 2050, the full facade replacement would reduce the total carbon emissions of the building by 18%. So this sort of answers that facade replacement can really make sense from a whole life carbon lens that we looked at, 70s building that was a poor performer. And so that would make sense. Next slide. So here are the high level summary takeaways from the study. So the headline is really this 54% potential reduction in emissions by 2050. And we think that the carbon story adds new impetus, a new perspective for changing office conversion eligibility, as it could result in meaningful emission savings, both on an individual level, but also if you're looking at this cumulatively for the city. So we've estimated that window of opportunity as up to 11 million tons of carbon saved by 2050 through the conversions and retrofits, which is equivalent to the annual emissions from 2.3 million passenger vehicles. So a significant amount. And that's the end of the slide. So thanks everyone for listening.
Well, Tess, thanks for that great briefing. Let's bring David back on and we'll start the Q&A, and I'll remind everybody to, I have a few questions and then we'll turn to the audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. So David, let's start with you. What does it take actually to convert buildings of this era?
Yeah, so it's quite different. A lot of the historical conversions of old office buildings to residential, have occurred with like pre-war buildings, right? And you can think of the Soho lofts or the old 1930s, bank buildings. And the key difference, in those older buildings is that they were designed previously before the advent of air conditioning, right? So they generally had slightly higher floor to floors, they had smaller floor plates, and they had, you know, masonry facades and punched windows. And so, you know, the main issues that you need to change when you're going from an office to a residential use, you need to meet legal light and air requirements, right? So you have to have operable windows, you have to have, you know, access to light. And so some of these earlier conversions, you know, for pre-war buildings, they already had operable windows, and the floor plates were smaller because they needed to, you know, kind of naturally ventilate those old office spaces. So they were a little bit easier. The new regulations are, you know, proposing to shift that eligibility, you know, from the pre-1961 buildings all the way up to 1990 buildings. So when you look at the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you know, office buildings changed quite a bit after air conditioning. The floor plates got deeper. You know, it's not uncommon to have a 50,000 square foot office floor plate, whereas like a, you know, a standard residential layout is a double loaded corridor bar building. You know, it wants to be like, you know, 60 feet wide, or 60 feet deep, really, with an apartment unit on each side of a central corridor. And with some of those bigger buildings, the bigger floor plate buildings, I always thought as a structural engineer that I wouldn't have much to play in the, you know, office to residential conversion, you know, game. I thought that it was all going to be all about, you know, putting new plumbing risers in the middle of the floor plate to service the bathrooms that, you know, that the offices didn't have and the residences need. But as we start to look at these new typologies of buildings, the, you know, the means to create that access to legal light and air require a lot more structural work. So, you know, some of these bigger floor plates, people are cutting light wells down the middle of the building in order to give access to light and air for, you know, for residential layouts. You know, we've proposed cutting away the, you know, if you make the move that you're going to replace the facade, then, you know, there's an argument to be said that, you know, perhaps a better solution is instead of putting in an internal light well, you could, you know, start to carve away the, you know, the outside of the building massing, and give people real views, you know, out into the neighborhood rather than, you know, into an inner light well. So there's actually some structural, you know, modifications that are needed to convert a lot of these buildings, as well as, you know, full replacement of the mechanical systems, and the introduction of operable windows, particularly on you know, the newer office buildings with curtain walls. Most of those do not have any operable windows, and so, you know, the minimum invasive kind of retrofit is to, you know, replace particular panes of glass and put in, you know, operable windows at those locations. But then you're still stuck with kind of the poor performance of most of these old single glaze systems.
Right. Thank you. And Tess, a big part of your findings are around embodied carbon, right? So help us understand, how is embodied carbon actually measured? And are there standards emerging in this space?
Yeah, definitely. So there are standards beginning to emerge in the embodied carbon space, but I think it's important to first point out that this has really only been mainstream in the industry for the past 7 years or so, the term, and looking at this type of data. So there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of guidelines, data collection, and it's pretty far behind operational emissions in terms of standards. The Carbon Leadership Forum is a group working to establish those standards, but there are so many different ways to calculate it and so many different views you can take of the data that it's hard to create standards and also to regulate. So that's something that a lot of cities and states are starting to look at, but it's still a bit tricky. And the way that you actually do the calculation today, if you were looking at a full building life cycle analysis, is straightforward, but it's still pretty labor intensive. So you basically take a look at all of the materials, typically only in the structure and enclosure of the building, which are the biggest components in terms of carbon, and you quantify them based on square footage or volume. And then you pair that quantification with typically manufacturer information or regional benchmarks for the carbon impact per unit of that material, and you multiply those two together to get the total impact of the building. And this last part is where there's been a lot of change recently. So the concrete industry, the steel industry are developing regional guidance for steel and concrete regional benchmarks. And there's been a large growth in the manufacturers that are actually reporting their emissions for specific products. And I just want to note that for this study, because it was so high level and we were looking typologically, we did use benchmark data for the footprint of structural systems and facades from a few aggregated tools. So we felt that was more accurate than going through one building and extrapolating the findings up for that. And we were also very specific about when we looked at emissions associated with just upfront carbon. So that's production and construction of the materials. So like until the moment something is installed on the building. Whereas we were also looking separately at just disposal. So when you're taking off a curtain wall or taking out windows, you're just considering how the footprint of how that material is being disposed. And this is because we were looking at a very specific timeline up to 2050 and this specific conversion scenario. But in a normal whole building life cycle analysis, you would look at production through demolition if this was ground up for everything out to set time, usually 40 years from now.
And then on the operational side, which is the other side of the coin here, can you help unpack that? Like, what were some of the largest contributors from operational savings?
Yeah, so we looked at a host of energy conservation measures that would be taken on during the retrofit, and we applied them based on the typology. It's also important to note that the first reduction actually comes from scaling the office building energy use intensity to residential use, which in the city, residential buildings have a lower energy use intensity than office buildings. So that's a first sort of reduction that we get, but we scaled that based on existing building performance. And then the energy conservation measures, ECMs, we call them, were lighting reduction, HVAC and domestic hot water electrification, window replacement, increasing wall insulation, and reducing air infiltration. And of those ECMs, the one with actually the biggest impact is reducing air infiltration. So making your facade tighter, reducing the air changes through the facade, reducing heat loss, things like that, which for this subset of buildings is particularly relevant because we have these 50-year-old single pane curtain wall facades, which have deteriorating sealants. They're incredibly leaky. And so that's about 13% that you can reduce from the existing performance. And then the second highest was electrification of that base building system, the HVAC and the domestic hot water, which was 7.4%. And that's what allows you to take advantage of the grid decarbonizing. And so what this means across our data set is that operationally, the type of building with the biggest savings are the curtain wall buildings, because they can take advantage of that full increased wall insulation and air infiltration from a full facade replacement. And so that type of building saw about a 49% reduction in energy use intensity when you account for the retrofits and the residential switch.
Great, thanks. And I think your study included 12 building typologies, is that right?
Yep.
So do the carbon savings kind of apply equally across those 12 typologies, or are certain buildings best first candidates that we should be looking at first?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question. And there are definitely certain typologies that saw larger savings. So to start, that wide typology that David was also talking about, that requires the major structural changes to make it fit for residential use, that has an added embodied carbon footprint that a narrow building doesn't have. So if we're trying to optimize for savings, focusing on that, the narrow buildings would be the best first place to start. And then the second piece is thinking about the facade type. So that has, there's sort of two sides to that coin, which is why it's helpful to look at a whole life carbon perspective. On the one hand, you do have the added embodied carbon footprint because you're replacing the full curtain wall facade. But you do see more operational emission savings over time. And we saw from that corollary that ultimately you do get more savings in 2050 than if you didn't replace the facade. So focusing on curtain wall buildings will also allow you to get the biggest total impact. And then the third point is, we've been talking about percent reductions, which are applied across the data set typologically. But if you shift to thinking about absolute emission savings, it's important to focus on, the low-hanging fruit, like what are the buildings that are the worst performers, because that percent reduction will give you a larger magnitude of savings. And this was an interesting thing we found in the data, that on average, it's the office buildings built in the 70s that have the current highest energy use intensity. They're over 80 kb2 per square feet versus mid 70s for the other decades. Can speculate about why that is, but basically to summarize, pick a 1970s building with the highest EUI you can, pick a narrow building, and then replace the curtain wall. Pick something with a curtain wall that can be easily replaced, and that's how you get the greatest savings.
Great, thanks. And I have one more question, then we're gonna go to the audience Q&A. I see good questions coming in, so thank you, keep them coming. David, how do we overcome barriers, right? When we talk about office conversions and conversations, people like to talk about why it can't be done. So what are the barriers and how can we overcome them for conversion?
Yeah, I mean, right now there's a number of barriers, right? There's economic barriers, there's regulatory barriers, and I think splitting those into two different buckets. The regulatory barriers, they don't exist for buildings that were built before 1961, and so the mayor's task force recommendations and the mayor's current City of Yes program and the legislative changes that are being recommended through both of these programs are trying to tackle the regulatory barriers, right? And the primary one is opening up the main issue is that a lot of the office buildings that were built during this time have been built with to an FAR, a floor area ratio over the site area, of anywhere from like 18 to 21. Whereas there's a general FAR cap for residential per zoning law of 12. So, those barriers mean that if your building isn't exempted, i.e. it was built before 1961 for, Manhattan south of 60th Street, or built before 1977 for the, the area of the financial district, then you wouldn't be able to convert that office area to resi because it would exceed the FAR cap. So you'd have to demolish, 30% of your building in order to fall under the FAR cap. So that's the biggest, most important one in my view, is to get the state assembly to pass the modification to those rules to enable the full FAR conversion. Then there's other issues around, around the rear yard spacings. So residential rear yard requirements are something like 30 feet. And, a lot of office buildings have party walls or have been built to a 15-foot, rear yard. And technically you'd have to, if the regulations are modified to allow for, for that reduced rear yard, then you'd have to, cut 10 feet off the back of your building in order to comply with the, with the residential rear yard requirements. And so the city council is looking to modify, those rules, and they'll be pushing to, to start kind of working through that with the city council over the fall. So I think, the economic barriers are, the conversion feasibility of these assets, if it's a pre-war building with punched windows, that are already operable, and it's effectively, a small floor plate where you can get good legal light and air with 30-foot lease spans, then there's not much stopping you, right? It's just the economic analysis. Effectively the asset price needs to drop low enough such that, the asset price plus the conversion cost, which is, roughly $300 a square foot, maybe $250 if it's an easy conversion and $350 if it's a hard conversion. That needs to be economically viable compared with buying a new land somewhere and building from scratch, right? And so the key question is, how low do asset prices go, right? That's going to dictate the amount of conversions that happen. And the risk of running on, the issue is, without legislation that both enables this and potentially incentivizes the inclusion of affordable housing into this, then it just means that we're going to have to wait for the office distress to get even worse until the asset prices drop low enough to make these things pencil out. The problem with that from an urban environment and a city perspective is that the property tax revenues are based on the value of the underlying asset. So as these, office values, drop, so does the tax revenue and the city budget. So, this is all about looking at the overall benefit to society, right? We have a housing crisis that we need to provide housing. We've got a climate crisis that it would be nice to do so without adding additional embodied carbon to the, to the atmosphere. And it's not about, this isn't about free handouts to developers. It's incentivizing, behavior that benefits society.
Right. Okay. Super. Let's jump into the audience questions. We have a lot of them, which is nice. And I'll remind the audience, you can upvote the questions. I'll be going in order of the upvoted questions for the most part here. So first one here, did you factor grid changes in the analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you remember those two whole life carbon cumulative emission graphs, the baseline, there's a much steeper slope to the operational carbon piece. And that's because a lot of these existing buildings are running on steam and they're still running on gas. So your, just total emissions are basically increasing incrementally each year. You're taking into consideration some grid decarb for your existing electricity load, but it's not the full energy load of the building. In the converted case where we electrified everything, we were able to place that full energy use of the building onto this decarbonizing grid. So we used local law 97 emissions factors out to 2030 and then projected farther for how the grid in the city will decarbonize. And that's why that line sort of flattens out, because over time, if you're fully electric and the grid is, theoretically fully renewable or mostly renewable, you're not adding emissions every year, right? That's the goal. That's why the city is trying to incentivize electrification.
And then there's a related question to that. Thank you. Here it is. It's about electrification and electrifying these residences. Can you still get the carbon savings even with a carbon-based energy source right now?
So it's interesting. So right now, actually, in terms of carbon, the buildings running on their fossil fuel systems are actually performing better than if they were electrified today, based on how dirty the grid is in New York City today. Obviously, it's going to change. What that overall graph would look like if you didn't electrify is you would mainly be seeing, you could get some benefits from some of the just efficiency measures we looked at. So the facade replacements, the window replacements, it wouldn't be quite as much. You'd be losing that 7% electrification, which expands out over time because of the decarbonizing grid. But you would still get that full embodied carbon benefit. So the full 61% reduction, which is significant. So,
Right.
You would still see
Even
some benefit.
On the mechanical, though, isn't there a beneficial trade-off there, because you're just upgrading systems that are just inherently more efficient because of modern technology?
Yeah, that's true. You would see some efficiency improvements from swapping the technology, but it's when you look out to 2050, where we have the full impact of the decarbonized grid, that percent reduction would start to shrink if you're still relying on fossil fuels.
Next question here. Would you say that more of the carbon savings come from ECMs or the use type change?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's the use type change takes us from an average EUI of 70 to an average EUI in the 50s. So that's a pretty considerable difference. That's about like 20%. So it's almost half and half from the use type change, and then half from the ECMs, although that's looking at energy use intensity, so that is not factor in carbon. So the impact of the electrification and the grid over time increases that one measure to have a much bigger impact than the 7% initial EUI drop that it gives us. That's a good question.
Next question here. If a developer wants to do this type of analysis for a single building, where would they start?
That's a good question. I mean, I think you start with your existing energy bills to understand how your building is performing, and you would then, the values we used for the embodied carbon baseline case are just a number per square foot of new construction. So it's an average benchmark number. So that's easily done. And they would expect to see, if the buildings are in the same time period, a similar percent saving result that we saw. Like your overall graph would look basically the same, it just at a much smaller magnitude.
And if if they were interested in, assessing, I guess trying to figure out what the question was related to. Are they looking to do a carbon assessment of a conversion, or are they just looking to test out, whether a conversion is feasible for the building? And if it's the latter, then the right approach is to take a look at what your floor plate is and get an architect or a team to take a look at it and see what what a test fit is, because the shape of your building is going to dictate kind of what type of conversion. Is it a deep retrofit, or is it effectively a a fit out modification? And that's that's all around the shape of the floor plate, the way your elevators are organized and where they're positioned. And then that initial kind of test fit layout can be can then input into a carbon assessment.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question on product selection. What type of heat pump systems would you propose using in these buildings?
So a lot of the conversions are utilizing a lot of the current conversions are utilizing a wall unit heat pump, and so it has a compressor in the unit. They're utilizing the facade modifications to to expel heat directly through the facade. They're trying to utilize, it's an all electric scheme, right? So, and it minimizes the amount of pipe work that, is needed to reach that heat pump. It's kind of contained per apartment. So it minimizes all the piping that you have to run through the rest of the building. There are other options that, could be more energy efficient, that could utilize heat recovery. So a lot of our new buildings are utilizing, air source heat pumps systems. So they've, they effectively have a fan coil unit in the apartment. They have an air source heat pump located either on the roof or in a mechanical room that has, access to outside air. And those units can, generate both heating and cooling at the same time. And transfer heat from, one part of the building to another, as well as generating, domestic hot water. So there's definitely efficiency gains to use a system like that, but it's a reasonably significant capital cost increase. It might add about $10 a square foot to a cost of conversion to go to an air source heat pump like that, like a centralized air source heat pump like that, with fan coil units in the units. So there's kind of a scale of MEP systems that could be used for these things, but the cheap and cheerful one is the wall unit heat pump.
Thank you. This is a good question, just clarification really. Does the carbon analysis take into consideration all the interior and structural modifications, David, that you mentioned, that need to take place to make these offices work as residences?
So there's a distinction there. So there's the structure and then there's the interiors. So this analysis was looking just at structure and enclosure in terms of embodied carbon, which is typical of life cycle analysis just because of where the data is at. So that was where that wide typology building, we accounted for some carving of the structure, demolition of the existing floor plates and main structural system, and then replacement of that same FAR on top. We didn't account for interiors, so interior partition walls in the analysis. And if you think about it, that sort of cancels out from a new build scenario, because in both cases you're putting in new interior walls. It's a good question.
Next question here. What's the typical construction timeline for this type of work? So I guess the question's about how long does it take to convert?
Yeah, so a lot depends on, obviously the best, the other thing that I didn't mention in terms of barriers to, to conversion, and this is both, it kind of falls under the economic bucket, but it's also the vacancy, right? And so if any of these office buildings have, tenants that are holding out, the best building to convert is one that's fully vacant, right? Because there's a cost to cutting out leases. So a lot depends on whether or not they have to phase it around existing tenants. And there are developers that are, that have a couple of floors that are remaining as office, and they're, converting the rest of the building to residential until those leases run out. And so that can drag, that timeline out, to a number of years, 4 or 5 years. But yeah, if you're just doing a conversion and it's, under the as of right rules, then I think it can be done on the order of 2 years. It's effectively a fit out if it's pretty light. A lot depends on whether or not you're doing a full replacement of the curtain wall, or if it's a deep retrofit where you're doing major structural modifications, that might drag that schedule out, up to another year.
And then building on that vacancy rate or vacancy, as you just mentioned, beyond the carbon emission reductions, this question is, has an economic analysis been done for all these changes? And if so, is it accounted for the revenue loss due to the vacancy rates?
So we haven't done an economic analysis as part of this study. But we have done, we have looked at cost estimating for, conversions and the, it's very hard to do this. One, if a building is fully occupied, the owners, they're not incentivized to convert to residential, right? It's very hard for them to walk away from, from their monthly paycheck when they get the lease payments every month. Where the buildings that are good candidates for conversion are the ones that are, that are struggling to attract the tenants, as offices, right? And so, part of the carbon benefit here is that, these buildings, if they're 50 or 60% vacant, a lot of the base building systems are still running and still utilizing operational carbon while they're, very underutilized as office assets. And over time, what we found from, the post-pandemic kind of workplace preferences is that the new buildings that, are one, generally much better performing environmentally, but they're, laden with amenities, they're close to transit, they're not having trouble leasing up, the new Class A office spaces. It's the older Class B and Class C office buildings that are struggling to to attract the tenants. And so, the best assets to convert are the ones that kind of fit the geometric requirements and at the same time are struggling to be successful as office buildings. So,
Thank you.
if they're not currently getting lease payments because they're empty, then there's no vacancy cost to feed into that economic equation.
Right. Here's like a market readiness type question. Do you have clients that are asking for this, conversion? Is there strong demand from owners and developers?
So a lot of people are looking at it, right? And a lot of people are figuring out what they want to do, as kind of a scenario planning. So we've worked with a number of developers to look at portfolios and to look at individual assets, and to see what modifications to the base building systems are needed to enable office conversions. We've priced those out, and any of the ones that are, there are a number of these projects, like, I sit down here on Water Street, just south of Wall Street, right? I can look out my window and see, 4 office buildings that had been converted, since the 90s when the regulations passed, enabling, 421G incentive program for downtown financial district, which incentivized conversions, as well as, pushing that 61 deadline to a 1970 deadline. So there's a lot of office conversions that have happened, down here in the financial district over time. And I can look out the window and see 3 of them that are ongoing now. The ones in Midtown, for these buildings that, have been built after 1961, they're not allowed to convert the full areas, right? So they are effectively studying this and waiting for legislative action, and to see where the market heads, right?
That answers the next question. Are buildings actually doing this? if you want to know the next building that's doing it, just see where Urban Green signs its next lease, because we've been kicked out of our last 2 buildings for retrofits, or conversions from office to residential. What's magic about 1990? Like, why isn't it 2005? Like, what's the rationale for the 1990 date, you think?
So I think the 1990 cutoff date is, when you think of it, the task force, when they were discussing this, they would like it to have been a rolling date, right? To have said that like any building that's older than 30 years or 40 years, right? Like a 30 to 40 year lifespan is generally what, maybe a 50-year lifespan is what people are designing for, right? The idea was that, it would be a real shame to, come in and convert a 2012 building, right? Like that's the embodied carbon investment, and it just hasn't had time to pay for itself, right? And so it's really the 1990 isn't some magical date. It was picked out in terms of saying these are 30 to 40-year-old buildings. By the time that they're going to get converted, they're probably reaching obsolescence. Is there going to be a number of landowners or office building owners who have buildings that were built in 1992 that are really pissed off that the cutoff wasn't shifted? Maybe, but it was just a line drawn in the sand that said this opens up a huge number of buildings that would make them newly eligible, right? It captured the big building boom of the 80s and 90s. Or sorry, of the 70s and 80s, but not the 90s.
Next question here. Did you factor any storage or time of use factor into the electrification?
That's a good question. We did not. So we were looking just at electrification, not any battery storage systems, and we were looking just at those published grid factors rather than looking at marginal emissions or time-specific emissions factors.
Okay, here's another question back to the embodied carbon, just to build off of that. Is there a way to calculate existing building materials for the embodied carbon to incentivize the amount of building you keep? So maybe Tess, just walk us through again, like how do you, if someone wants to measure embodied carbon in the building, like what are the actual steps to do?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and I get this from my students a lot. So I think, there's not much value in quantifying the building itself that's already there, because that embodied emissions was spent 30 years ago, right? It's already created, it's warming, it's gone. We need to not worry about it. We need to, look to the future. So that's why we rather do the replacement scenario. So if you were to tear it down, or if you were to build new, what would the embodied carbon impact be that you're saving? So it's about saved emissions today rather than emissions that happened 30, 40 years ago. And so that's why, our baseline was looking at comparable new construction, because that's what you're replacing if you're reusing an existing building.
Got it. Thank you. Next question here. We just have time for 1 or 2 more here. What insight can you share on the cost per square foot for the conversions for some of the more common building typologies? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the on the invasiveness of the conversion. We were looking at a building that needed to have something like 30 or 40,000 square foot. So it's like a 750,000 square foot building that needed to have about 40,000 square foot cut out of the lower floor plates in order to achieve the light and air requirements. It was utilizing, it had a, steam absorption chillers and steam heat with, perimeter induction units. So it was, completely, getting rid of that mechanical system and switching it out to an electrified, heat pump system. This one was not replacing the facade, but it was making facade modifications to add operability to the, to the existing facade windows. they had just recently, they had recently replaced the glazing in their facade system from single pane to double pane. And that was coming out at anywhere from $325 to $350 a square foot, depending on whether or not we added the the area that we took out, that we carved out of the base of the building, if we added it up to the top or not.
Got it. And last question, which isn't here, but I'm going to ask it, is in 30 seconds you guys have, what surprised you the most about the analysis? Tess, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. I think that facade payback really did surprise me. I thought it would pay back, within the time frame out to 2050, but I didn't expect to see it pay back within 10 years. And so that was really encouraging. It encourages action, it encourages retrofits and improvements. And so that was exciting to see.
Great. And David, what surprised you?
Yeah, I think the facade bit was very interesting, because I think like the quality of the spaces that we can create with these buildings is a lot depends on whether or not it makes sense to to redo the facade. And if you take the stance that you're keeping the facade, then you've really constrained yourself to to moves with like internal light wells and things for to convert some of these deep some of these deep floor plates. And so if it's not an environmental negative to to replace the facade, but rather a beneficial measure, then I think it can unlock some value when you look at like selectively carving around the outside of the building, and getting real views and market quality apartments, rather than some of the shotgun style apartments that are very efficient and very economically viable for a certain demographic, right? Generally the 20 to 25-year-olds, that's what a lot of the financial district conversions are targeted towards, and they're studio apartments with 2 home offices, which are effectively 2 bedrooms without windows. But once you look at the replacement of the facade as part of these things, and opening up opportunities to carve around the outside, then you can get apartments that are really nice and equivalent to what you'd build new, maybe even nicer because they have higher floor to floors.
Right. Okay, well, we're at the top of the hour here, so we'll have to leave it there. I want to thank Arup for doing this great study and helping to increase the body of knowledge and answering this big question. So thank you. And I really want to thank you, Tess and David, for joining us today. Thanks for spending time with Urban Green. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Sure. Great. Anushka, let's bring the slides back up. Want to thank again, a shout out to the U.S. Green Building Council for the sponsorship of today's program. We really appreciate their partnership. Upcoming events, we have one left, and this is your big opportunity. Our member holiday reception is tonight at the Fisher and Paykel Experience Center, 6 to 8 p.m. There's still room if you'd like to join us. It's great because the test chefs at Fisher and Paykel actually cook food in front of us, and it's really delicious. So please join us for the member reception tonight if you can make it. And finally, this is our last program of the year, certainly our last Urban Green program of the year. We want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for all your support over the year. We want to wish you a really safe and happy and healthy holiday season. And we'll see you bright and early in 2024 with more Urban Green programming. So thank you very much for joining us today.